Hi there, welcome to this course on infrastructure finance. I am going to briefly talk to you about what we are going to cover in this course in this initial introductory lecture, and then we will go on from there. This first lecture is going to be an overview of what this course is all about, and I am going to explain to you what are the different topics that we will cover in this course. I am also going to talk to you about the different examples and sectors that we are going to cover, and I will also tell you what we will have to do at the end of each and every lecture. Quickly, I am going to talk about myself for some time. We will also talk about the course objectives, and then how are we going to do this course, followed by some introductory concepts on infrastructure finance. Let me talk a little bit about myself. I am an associate professor at IIT Madras in the Department of Management Studies. I am actually teaching this course on infrastructure finance for the last about 7 years to the graduate students at IIT Madras, both in the civil engineering department and in the Department of Management Studies, and the topics that we handle in that course are fairly advanced, and we felt that there has to be a course that introduces the subject of infrastructure finance to a large number of students. So the objective of this course is essentially that, to provide a much basic understanding about infrastructure finance to a large number of students, both from engineering, financial, business, and who are having exposure to economic subjects as well. Now let us go to the course objectives. So the first objective is to provide an overview of the various features of infrastructure sector. Infrastructure sector has several unique features that are not found in most of the other industries. So we will have to first understand what are the different features that characterize infrastructure sector, and then how we finance an infrastructure project is largely influenced by the characteristics of that sector. So we cannot study financing in isolation. We will have to look at the various project characteristics before we actually look into the aspect of how we finance them. So the first few lectures is going to be to really understand about infrastructure sector, and then look at how we are going to finance it in the later parts of the course. The second objective of this course is also to give an introduction to project finance. So there are several ways in which projects or companies are being financed. One of the ways is project finance. We find project finance commonly being used in infrastructure sector, and we will also try and see what is this project finance all about, why is it more suited to infrastructure sector, what are the advantages, what are the drawbacks, under what circumstances project financing should be used, how project financing should be structured, and so on and so forth. The third is to also expose to what is called as financial analysis. I understand many of you would have different backgrounds. Some of you would have an engineering background, some of you would have background in science, some of you might have several years of work experience in the industry in terms of implementing projects, in terms of project operations, in terms of project management, but there are many of you who might not have understood some of the basic concepts of finance. So before we actually get into dealing with infrastructure finance, we have to really understand some of the basic objectives of financing, and that is what we will do in the third module of this course. So here we will try and understand the basic concepts in finance as far as a company is concerned. For example, we will look at a profit and loss account, we will look at a balance sheet, we will look at how do we actually decide whether a project is worth financing or not, and topics related to that. Fourth, we will look at project finance markets. What do we actually mean by project finance market? That is, we are looking at finance markets, and there are different types of finance markets. For example, if you look at broadly, financing can be divided into two categories. The first is equity, the second is debt. And within debt there are long term debt, there is mezzanine debt, and then there is short term debt, and so on. So we will have to understand the characteristics of these different finance markets. If you look at equity, there are again several types of equity. There is external equity by individual investors, and we also have what is called as sponsor equity, where the promoters of the project invest in the equity of the project. So we will have to really look at the different characteristics of each of these finance markets and then see how we can leverage them to finance our project. The fifth module, and which I think is also the very important one, is to understand risk management aspects in infrastructure projects. Most of these projects have several unique features, and it is very important that these projects are structured in such a way that the risk aspect is appropriately addressed. So today we are looking at substantial amount of private investment in the infrastructure sector, and the basic decision of a private investor is to check whether he is going to get adequate returns. Is he going to recover his investment, and in addition to that, is he actually going to get his returns from the project to make it financially worthwhile. So to ensure that the project gives the investor adequate returns, he will have to ensure that there are appropriate risk management strategies in place. So this fifth module is going to talk about various ways of risk management in infrastructure projects, and how do we ensure that these are appropriate enough to ensure returns for the private investor. Next we look at different types of infrastructure projects. So infrastructure is a very broad term, and within infrastructure there are several sectors. We have energy, which in turn consists of oil and gas, electricity, non-conventional energy, and so on. Then we have a transportation sector, then we have water supply sector, we have telecommunication sector. So each of these sectors have different characteristics, and we need to understand the characteristics of each of the sectors to sensitize ourselves into what would be the most appropriate way of financing this project. So we will look at details and the unique features of the different sectors and how these are very important in understanding how they are financed in the sixth module. And then finally the seventh module, we look at some of the special topics in infrastructure financing. So for example, when people start funding a project, they do not do it everything on their own. A group of lenders join together to fund a project, which is called as syndication. So that is what I will call is one of the special topics we will look at. More recently what we find is we have a lot of private equity investment that is happening in the infrastructure sector. So we will also look at what is this private equity investment and what is the impact of having private equity in infrastructure projects and so on. So these are some of the advanced topics trying to encapsulate the recent trends that we see on this subject. So in terms of the course structure which I have just explained, the course structure has 7 modules, and each of the 7 objectives that we just mentioned is going to be discussed in each of the modules. The number of lectures would be about 40, and each lectures would have about a 50-minute duration. At the end of each and every lecture, I am going to list out a couple of thought questions which will help you to reflect on whatever we have did in these lectures. So you can go back, think of what we did in the lecture, and then try and put on your thinking cap to see whether you can give a response to the thought questions that I have put in the end of every chapter. And in the subsequent session we will start with the thought questions and then see whether you have proceeded on the right track. But it is very important that you try and think and craft a response to these questions before we move to the subsequent session. In addition, some of you might be interested to know more about topics that we have discussed. So wherever possible, I am going to give you a list of additional reading which you can refer to if you are interested. So in case you want to get additional knowledge, in case you want to know more about a particular topic more than what you have covered in the lecture, you can look at these sources of additional reading and then try and enrich yourself. Next we will look at what we are going to cover today, which is to kind of get an overview of infrastructure. First question is, what do we mean by infrastructure? So we have to really look at infrastructure in totality before we go down to sectors. Why is infrastructure important? Every one of us is obviously going to use one service from an infrastructure at least in our daily life. So for example, when we get up in the morning, when we switch on the power supply in our room, we are actually getting access to electricity. So electricity is one of the basic infrastructure sectors. So the reason why infrastructure is actually occupying a lot of importance in policy making is it is very critical for economic growth. Today if you look at it, most of the country's think tank are talking about how do we actually improve the country's economic growth, and economic growth actually plays a very important role in the minds of the policy makers. So there are different engines which can actually increase economic growth, and it is now recognized that infrastructure is going to play a very important role in improving economic growth. Providing more infrastructure, providing better infrastructure, providing high quality infrastructure is actually going to increase economic growth, and that is the reason why infrastructure is playing a very important role for policy makers. It also plays a very important role in our day to day lives. As I have just mentioned, it helps us to make our lives more productive, it gives us a lot of convenience, it facilitates day to day economic transactions. So not only it is important for policy makers, it is also important for the common citizenry in improving their day to day lives. But one thing that we have to understand is infrastructure means many things for many people. There is an attempt to actually define what is infrastructure, but a consistent definition has not emerged so far. Okay, though there is some kind of uniformity in understanding what do we mean by infrastructure, a clear definition that categorizes what is infrastructure and what is not is still underway. There are obviously definitions, as we will see later, from the government's perspective, but there are differences between the different versions as well. So a simple definition of infrastructure can be something like this: the physical components of interrelated systems providing commodities and services essential to enable, sustain or enhance societal living conditions. So this is fairly broad, but that is what is one of the simple definition of infrastructure. So what it means? Generally people say infrastructure means power, it means telecommunication, it means water supply, sanitation, sewerage, it means roads, it means railways, it means ports, airports, etc. Let us look at the definition in a little bit more technical sense. The economic survey defines infrastructure as consisting of the following 9 broad sectors. For example, it says power, specifically electricity generation, is under infrastructure, coal production is infrastructure, petroleum production, crude oil and refinery throughput, cement production, railways, specifically if you are looking at freight and passenger traffic, then you have ports, then you have civil aviation consisting of airports, then you have roads and telecommunications. So these are the 9 sectors that has been defined as infrastructure in the economic survey. Now there is another definition of infrastructure under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. Let us look at what are those. So they have the following definition, they starting with construction. As you might see, this definition of the ministry is much more broader as compared to what we have seen in the economic survey, because it looks at a lot of other activities and segments as infrastructure. For example, it looks at construction as infrastructure. So construction, infrastructure projects can be classified under construction, but then construction can actually mean a whole lot of other things. It could mean construction of real estate, it could mean construction of industrial parks and so on and so forth. Then we look at electricity, and electricity again it looks at broadly 3 different segments, and each of the segments are classified under infrastructure. For example, you have generation, you have transmission and then you have distribution. All of it is electricity and all of them constitute as infrastructure. Then we have gas generation and distribution through pipes. In India we do not really have pipe distribution of gas, most of it is transported physically at least to the consumers. But in overseas location, like we have water, like we have electricity, gas is transported to individual households in terms of pipes. So that actually is an integral part of infrastructure and in many western countries. Water works and supply is a part of infrastructure. And energy, we have non-conventional energy, that is generating power from wind, generating power from solar, all of this will also be considered as a part of infrastructure. Then we have railway tracks, associated infrastructure to railway tracks such as signaling systems and railway stations, this would be classified under infrastructure. And then road transport, roads, bridges, runways, they all will be infrastructure. Then you have airport facilities as infrastructure, telecommunication lines, basically there is a fixed line telephony, there is mobile line telephony, so both of this telephone lines and the telephone network is classified under infrastructure. Then you have waterways, both riverways and seaways, all of this will come under infrastructure. Then airport facilities, according to along with airports we also have seaports, so the port facilities will be under infrastructure. Then you have various canal networks that are used for irrigation, that will also be under infrastructure. Then sanitation and sewerage. So if you really look at it, the ministry defines infrastructure as something very broad consisting of several segments, and this from the ministry's perspective would qualify for being tagged as an infrastructure segment. Let us broadly look at types of infrastructure and see what is the scope of this course on infrastructure. First is physical infrastructure. So physical infrastructure is something that what you have looked at all along so far. Whatever is being mentioned under the economic survey, whatever is being mentioned by the ministry is all coming under what is called as a physical infrastructure. For example, airports, roads and electricity is all physical infrastructure. We should also understand that there are other types of infrastructure that we should be aware of. The next is very important, which is called as your social infrastructure. So social infrastructure will include things like schools, hospitals and so on. Okay. They have several characteristics that are common with some of the physical infrastructure projects, but then they also have so many differences. The next would be what I would call the institutional infrastructure. Institutions such as banks, tax collection mechanism, the legal systems, they all would generally being classified as institutional infrastructure. So these are systems and these are institutions that are needed for the day-to-day transaction to happen. Then you have industrial infrastructure. These are basically industrial parks, special economic zones and so on. So for promotion of various industries, it is very critical that there is high quality industrial infrastructure that is available. So we have several of those initiatives that are being undertaken by various governments. So in essence, we look at it, there are several types of infrastructure. So my question is, infrastructure can be used as a noun or can be used as an adjective. So noun is essentially to denote different ways in which we classify an infrastructure, and then when we say an adjective we qualify in more precise terms. For example, when we look at infrastructure financing, there are some special ways and techniques that are involved in infrastructure financing. So many of the techniques that we actually use in financing infrastructure projects is also used in sectors other than infrastructure. See, for example, today if you look at in information technology, setting up of offshore development centers, people use it what is called as a BOT concept to set up many of these offshore development centers. Remember, originally BOT was a concept that was used in financing of infrastructure projects. So what we are seeing is today most of the techniques that are used in financing infrastructure are being used in non-infrastructure sectors as well. So is infrastructure a noun or an adjective? My answer is it is both. What we will specifically do in this course is we will look at only the physical infrastructure aspect of it. Obviously there are limitations in terms of time, there are limitations in terms of how much we can cover in a 40 lecture course. So therefore we will stick to our discussion on physical infrastructure, but then there are several components in physical infrastructure that we are going to handle is also going to be applied in other sectors of infrastructure, and I will leave that to you, to your imagination, to see how this can be applied in a very beneficial way in other types of infrastructure as well. Why is this important? Why should you actually be studying about infrastructure finance? I will tell you the reasons. Traditionally, if you look at it, infrastructure has been largely funded by the government. When I say traditionally, I would say starting from middle of 19th century, that is from 1950s onwards. So before that there has been substantial private enterprise in the infrastructure sector, but from 1950s onwards most of the infrastructure development starting from developed countries or in developing countries has been largely done by the government sector. Now we have seen earlier that infrastructure is very important for economic growth. Now as countries wanted to achieve higher and higher economic growth, the demand for infrastructure creation also increased tremendously. So when they wanted to increase or achieve higher, they need to invest more in infrastructure. Now there is only so much the government can actually do in terms of increasing more and more investment in infrastructure. Beyond a point, obviously there are questions in terms of how much deficit that the government can undertake by continuously funding infrastructure. So because of these limitations of governments unable to continuously meet all of the requirements of infrastructure, the government has started opening to private sector for investing in infrastructure. So the government was not in a position to meet the demand, but at the same time they have to sustain the economic growth, the investment needs to be made somehow, and that is where the private sector started coming in. So today what we see is there has been increasingly substantial amount of private sector coming in creating infrastructure, but private sector coming in and creating infrastructure brings its own complexities, mainly because of the unique features of this infrastructure sector. So we have to really understand the complexities. The challenge is today to see how we can attract private sector investment in infrastructure and how we can sustain the private sector investment in infrastructure and how private sector gets adequate returns from these projects and at the same time not adversely affect the population who is going to be consumers of this various infrastructure sector. And studying infrastructure finance will help us to really understand the dynamics of the infrastructure sector, the context of the infrastructure sector, and at the same time how to attract private sector investment in the sector. So it is important because it touches each of our lives on a daily basis. It is important because the amount of funding needed is very large, and it is also important because it has substantially very attractive investment opportunities for the private sector. So studying this is important from several perspectives. Now let us look at some of the characteristics of infrastructure projects. Before we look at characteristics of infrastructure projects, we should also understand a little bit about public goods. In economics, any good can be broadly classified into two categories: public goods and private goods. What is a public good? So we can understand public goods by their main characteristics, which is called as your indivisibility or non-excludability. That is, it costs no more to provide a service to an individual as compared to several. That is, the cost it takes to provide a service to a single person is not going to be very different as compared to the total cost it takes to provide a service for a large number of users. Okay. So that is a main characteristic of a public good. There are also other characteristics such as indivisibility or non-excludability. It is very difficult to exclude somebody from consuming a particular service, and services which makes this very difficult to exclude anybody from consuming a service is commonly called as a public good. What is an example of a public good? The classic example of a public good is what is called as a lighthouse. So when we actually have a lighthouse, A lighthouse can actually provide direction to ships that come to a harbor, but at the same time it is going to be very difficult to exclude a ship from obtaining direction from a lighthouse, and the cost of constructing a lighthouse is going to be no different if it is actually going to provide direction to one ship or to provide direction for all the ships that are coming to the harbor. Okay. So there is this question of non-excludability. It practically becomes very difficult to exclude a ship from getting direction from a lighthouse if it is functioning when it is approaching a harbor. The second characteristics of a public good is what is called as our externality. That is, those who are not directly being affected, those who do not consume the service, they might also be affected by some of the spillovers that emanate from the project. Let me again give you an example. Let us take the case of an airport being constructed. So the people who are going to be benefited by the airport is actually those who are going to use the airport, that is, people who are going to fly in from other destinations or people who are going to fly out from that particular city. So airport is generally going to be beneficial for people, travelers, and it could also actually be beneficial for people who are going to be part of the airport activity. For example, there could be a hotel who is going to cater to the demands of the travelers who are coming to the airport. There are retailers who might have actually opened up shops within the airport to provide various products and goods to travelers in the airport. So they are all people who are directly connected to the airport. But then when an airport comes up, the airport is also going to affect the people who are living nearby. For example, because of the planes landing and because of the planes taking off, there could be increased amounts of noise pollution for people who are living in the vicinity of the airport. Now these are the people who are not going to use the services of the airport, but at the same time they are getting affected because of the presence of the airport. So this is an example of an externality. So in this case, this noise pollution can be seen as a negative externality. Okay. They are people who are not going to be in any way benefited because of the airport, but at the same time they have to endure higher levels of noise because of the functioning of the airport. Now there could be some positive externalities as well. What are the positive externalities? The airport brings in a lot of development to that particular region. So there could be more travelers coming in, and because of the travel there could be demands in terms of higher quality of infrastructure, there could be higher level of industrial development, and so on and so forth. And because of this increased level of development in the region surrounding the airport, the real estate value can increase. So therefore people who have real estate holdings around the airport, they might actually experience an increase in their wealth. So in this case, this is a positive externality. There is an increase in wealth because of the presence of the airport. There are people who are not going to use the airport, but at the same time because of the presence of an airport they are getting some benefits. So that is a positive externality. So these externalities are features of several infrastructure projects, and these externalities are a feature of public goods as well. The third is a non-rivalry. One person's consumption is not going to affect the consumption of another person. So this is very different when compared to, let us say, a private good. Let us take the example of a simple bread. A bread when consumed by somebody is not available for another person to consume, so it actually has characteristics of rivalry. Now let us take the case of infrastructure projects. In a road, a movement of a car is not going to affect a movement of a second car till we actually reach some level of congestion. So till the time that we are actually reaching a point of congestion, presence of one car is not going to really affect the presence of a third car or a fourth car in the road. So there is what is called as a non-rivalry characteristic which we see in public goods. Many infrastructure projects have shades of this public good characteristics. Remember, they are not pure public goods, because at some point in time infrastructure projects have kind of features that are not purely public. Let us take an example of a road project. A road project, the non-rivalry characteristic exists till we reach a point of congestion, and after that presence of any additional car is actually going to affect the movement of all others who are present in the road, okay. But till we actually reach a point of congestion, it is a non-rivalry characteristic. So infrastructure projects have shades of public good characteristic, and this is very important for us to understand when we actually look at the next aspect of financing. There are also other features of infrastructure projects. They are natural monopoly. What do we mean by natural monopoly? A natural monopoly indicates that it is economically, socially not beneficial to have competition in the segment, because having a single player will be able to provide the services at the lowest cost because of the factors of economies of scale. An existing provider will be able to provide services at a lower cost as compared to a second player coming in as competition. So many of the infrastructure projects are natural monopolies. For example, we have electricity distribution. It does not make sense to have competition in electricity distribution, because a single player will be able to supply electricity cheaply to residential and other consumers as compared to having multiple competitors. The second feature is high sunk costs. Substantial investments need to be made before the projects can actually start delivering an output, or they can actually start providing a service. And not only that, the investment that is actually made cannot be used for any other purpose. Let us say, for example, we actually install a pipeline for delivering water supply. Now that pipeline cannot be used for anything else. It cannot be used for delivering, let us say, gas. It cannot be used for, let us say, providing a sewage network, and so on. So an asset that has been created for a particular purpose can actually be used only for that purpose. There is very little alternative use. So therefore, if there is any change in economic conditions, all the investment that has been made comes to naught. So there is a high amount of sunk cost that we see in the infrastructure sector. The third aspect is non-tradability of output. That is, a surplus in one region cannot be traded to meet a shortfall in the other. Let us say there is going to be surplus water in a particular region, or let me take another example, that they say there is surplus power in a particular region and there is a shortfall in power in region B. It becomes very difficult to transfer power from region A to region B unless until there is adequate transmission network. Okay. So this actually is used to refer to the non-tradability of output. Fourth is non-rivalry in consumption up to congestion limits, that we have discussed it just a little while ago. There is a possibility of price exclusion. You can actually exclude some consumers consuming infrastructure sector by pricing it appropriately. Remember, demand in economy is also a question in terms of price, and we can actually influence demand by actually pricing it appropriately. And we have also seen there are substantial amount of externalities in infrastructure projects, which is what the last point states. Physical characteristics of infrastructure projects. The projects have very high initial costs. When I say high initial cost, I am really comparing it with, let us say, sectors other than infrastructure. In sectors other than infrastructure, it is actually possible to generate service, generate revenues without making all the investment that is needed at one go, but in infrastructure it is not possible. If an airport needs to be constructed, the entire investment that is needed for the airport to be constructed has to be put in place before planes can land or take off. Okay. So this level of initial costs as compared to other sectors is very high. Second, infrastructure projects function as a network. It cannot derive value in isolation. For example, the value of a single phone is 0 unless until there is another telephone with which it can communicate with, there is no value in that particular asset. Similarly, if you look at power sector, unless until there is a transmission line which can actually take the power generated in the generating stations to the end consumers, there is no value in generating power. So infrastructure sectors derive value from a network and not from individual isolated projects. The third is investments are lumpy. We cannot make incremental investments in the infrastructure sector. That is, we cannot increase supply in tune with the demand because of the fact that there are substantial economies of scale in creating supply. When we actually put up a generating plant, the bigger the generating plant, the lower is the cost of power that is actually generated from that plant. So when we actually have to invest in power, we actually make a substantial investment anticipating future demand so that we are able to generate power at the least cost. In many other sectors, the investments happen on an incremental basis, but in infrastructure sector we see there is substantial amount of lumpiness in investment. The fourth characteristic is asset specificity, which you just mentioned earlier. Assets are highly specific. It can be used only for that purpose for which it has been created. The alternative uses are very less, and in many cases there are actually no alternative uses. Assets have a limited life and additional investments are needed for the assets to be functioning for a longer period. We need to actually have maintenance investments done after a certain period of time for the asset to be functioning on for a longer duration. And the fifth point, the inability to use stage commitment. We cannot actually finance an infrastructure projects in parts. In many sectors, projects are being financed in parts because one is able to see the progress and make the next investment if the progress in the previous stage is satisfactory. But in the infrastructure sector, one may not be in a position to assess the progress made unless until the project is fully complete. For example, think yourself, what is the value of a bridge that is half complete? There is no value. Unless until the bridge is fully complete, we may not be able to see what is the worthiness of that bridge. So a stage commitment which looks at the benefits of the project at each and every stage is something might not be applicable in the case of infrastructure sector. Let us look at some of the concepts related to infrastructure access. It is very important to realize that economic growth needs infrastructure, but it is also more important for us to understand that infrastructure should be available across all sections of society. It cannot be made restricted to some of the elite segments. In that case, the economic growth is unlikely to happen. So our vision of achieving the economic growth can be realized only if infrastructure is made available to a large section of society. So therefore there is something called a compulsory service obligation. Infrastructure providers cannot refuse to provide service if the consumer is satisfying all the criteria. What happens when you enter a restaurant? When you enter a restaurant, you might see a signal prominently displayed at a restaurant saying that rights of admission reserved. That is, the restaurant owner has the right to stop you from using the restaurant service if he chooses to. But if you look at an infrastructure project, the provider cannot refuse to give you a service if you are able to meet all the other stipulations that have been put together by the service provider. That is, if you are a resident of that particular region, if you are able to pay the connection and the subscriber charges, in other words, if you are a valid consumer, they will have to compulsorily give you service. So that is a compulsory service obligation. The third aspect is regulation. We have seen that many of these infrastructure projects have natural monopoly characteristics. So therefore when you actually have private service providers delivering the service, there is a possibility that they may take advantage of their monopoly power. So to prevent that from happening, there is what is called as a regulatory regime. So today in society there are several organizations which help us to carry on with our daily functions. For example, if we have any complaint, we actually go to the police station. Similarly, if there are any complaints with the infrastructure service provider, the regulatory agency ensures that there is a level playing field. The private service providers are not exploiting the consumers. So the regulatory agency ensures that the consumers are not taken advantage of by the service providers. People are also trying to introduce competition in several infrastructure sectors. We have the classic case of telecommunication. So today if you are not satisfied with one telecom service provider, you switch to another telecom service provider. We see competition in several other economic segments, for example in other consumer goods. We are also seeing aspects of competition in infrastructure sector. We do not see it in all, but we see it in some segments of infrastructure, notably in telecom. And when we look at competition, there are several types of competition. We are having competition not only in the market, but we are having competition for the market. When we talk about competition in the market, an example is the telecom market, where there are several service providers competing to provide services to the consumers. But there are other segments where it is economical to have only one service provider. So in that case we do not really have competition in the markets. So what we have is, we have competition for the markets. That is, when the government makes a bid for private sectors to participate in the project, there is competition. So competition happens at the bidding stage but not in the operating stage. So that is called as your competition for the market. So to quickly let us summarize what we have done in this session so far. 4 important points emerge. One is, the provision and the availability of infrastructure plays an important role in economic growth. So let us also remember that the provision and availability of infrastructure should be for all segments of society. More the people who have access to this infrastructure, higher will be the economic growth. And when we say infrastructure, we also have to remember that the quality of the infrastructure is very high. So in many cases there is provision of infrastructure, but the quality levels are very bad. So we have to understand that infrastructure should not only be present, but it should also be provided at fairly higher quality levels. Second, infrastructure has characteristics that makes it very different from other sectors. What are the characteristics that we saw? We saw that they have shades of characteristics that are seen in public goods. The investments are lumpy. Infrastructure derives its advantage when they function as a network. They are very specific in the sense that assets created for a particular purpose cannot actually be put into use for alternate uses. So these are some of the features of infrastructure projects, and when we are trying to finance projects that have these characteristics, what are the things that we should take care of? So that is something that we will look at in the subsequent lectures. And 3, we have very high economic growth rates in the emerging countries today, and most of the emerging countries are very keen that they sustain this economic growth, and a strategy that they are using to sustain this economic growth is to create adequate infrastructure, to continuously invest in infrastructure to meet the demand. And there are limitations in terms of how government on its own can fund this additional demand. So therefore the sector is being open to the private sector. There are a lot of challenges in having the private sector invest in the infrastructure sector because of some of the characteristics that we have seen earlier in this lecture. So the challenge is the ability to attract private sector investment by taking into account these challenges and trying to put in place a structure and a format which will address many of the issues that we see in the infrastructure sector. And finally, ensuring infrastructure access for all sections of the society will play an important role in ensuring what is called as equity. Today the burning topic is, when you are looking at development, are we ensuring equitable development to all sections of society? Providing infrastructure with access across all segments of the society will ensure that the development that we have is equitable. Okay, now what I will do is I will pose some thought questions for you to ponder about. Question number 1: can you think of public goods? We have discussed, let us say, an example of a lighthouse earlier, but can you think of public goods other than that what we have discussed in the lecture, and see why they are public goods? What characteristics of the public goods that we have discussed is present in those projects that make them as public good? The second question I have is, let us say government is planning to set up a new airport in city A. What could be the externalities associated with the project? We have touched upon it briefly earlier in the lecture, but I would want you to discuss this in greater detail. You should also look at both the positive externalities as well as the negative externalities. Remember, successfully implementing a project would mean that not only it is financially viable, but project, for it to be successfully implemented, it should be able to encounter most of the objections that come from the local populace, and for that to be successfully for us to successfully overcome the objections of the local populace, we will have to understand what could be the various negative externalities that such project can bring about. So let us think through and see what are the different externalities that could be associated with this project. And finally, in case you want to know more about infrastructure, the most simple and a very interesting place where you can look at is Wikipedia. So the link that I show here gives you the link on infrastructure in Wikipedia, and it provides you in a very simple language on the various aspects of infrastructure and why it is very important for us to know those aspects to implement and finance these projects. Thank you and see you in the next lecture.